Well, I've just vacated my home after 7 years following a Section 21 repossession notice. Could I have a receipt for the keys? Yeah. Okay, thanks very much indeed. The first 5 years were probably the most peaceful of all my renting years, but about 2 years ago, when the property was sold, we had the letting agent's PAD4U of Stockport thrust upon us. Within weeks they'd cut down the beautiful front tree, then left the front garden looking like a rubbish tip for the best part of the next 2 years. Still, it was their property, and they can of course do or not do whatever they like with it. They continuously fobbed me off with promises even for the simplest of repairs, such as the front doorbells. When they first acquired the property, they were full of reassurances that nothing would change until they hiked my rent by 25%. The condition of my flat certainly didn't reflect the rent that they were proposing, so I contacted the local authorities, essentially for an assessment to use as evidence for an intended fair rent appeal. Although it wasn't my intention, the local authorities then gave the landlords a list of jobs to carry out. I did welcome the much-needed installation of a sink in the shower room, albeit without hot water. The most serious issue was one of damp, which was steadily getting worse. Now, although the local authorities assured me that this would be addressed, I was to hear nothing more on the matter. All the classic signs of penetrating damp were present, the numerous circular damp patches and very distinct tide marks exactly matching the damp bricks outside. Even the condensation patterns that this created were mirrored by these tide marks. The worst affected area was just under the window, where water droplets actually formed on the internal wall during any extended period of rainfall. And here is exactly where PAD4U decided to install an electric space heater. Despite my protestations that this was the worst affected area, PAD4U assured me that the installation would be carried out in conjunction with treating the outside wall. This treatment, of course, was never carried out. The inevitable result was a breeding ground for damp and mould. The first couple of times the heater was used, the constant evaporation of the relentless penetrating damp created condensation which covered every surface in the room. The third time it was used, the switch, which was constantly wet, blew the main fuses. It was never used again, and I have been unable to raise the slightest concern from PAD4U. Instead, they were to insist that the problems were mainly caused by lifestyle, inadequate heating, lack of ventilation, etc., etc., etc. Every excuse in the book. They even suggested that my breathing at night was part of the problem. Now, although I'm familiar with the physics behind exhalation and moisture, it certainly doesn't explain why the problem has worsened over the past 2 winter seasons, unless, of course, they're suggesting that I've been holding my breath at night for the previous 5 years. On the bright side, at least PAD4U did provide wonderful facilities for my subtenants, and there were plenty of them. Millipedes, woodlice, centipedes, they all came out to play in the wonderful rotting atmosphere that PAD4U so very kindly provided. After my 4th complaint about the severe damp problems, which now necessitated me sleeping in the hallway, PAD4U were to carry out what they described as remedial work. They installed an extractor fan. Although this remedial work didn't, of course, remedy anything at all, it did give an almost spiritual, relaxing sound which allowed you to float away and briefly forget about all the problems in the world. Very suddenly there was a lot of activity. The 2 years I saw at the front of the property was suddenly transformed. The bells were magically repaired. The carpets in the hallway and stairs were ripped out and replaced. Even all the communal areas, after 2 years, painted and freshened up. They'd put the property up for sale. they hiked my rent yet again by a further 15.5%, and I noticed these new figures were being promoted in their advertising, illustrating the potential rental income of the property. As they'd hiked my rent again and done nothing constructive to address the penetrating damp problems, I made a request to PAD4U under Section 1 of the Landlord-Tenant Act 1985 for the contact details of my landlords so that I might communicate with them directly. PAD4U failed to provide those details within the 21 days required by law, committing a criminal offence, a summary offence in the process. I later discovered that my landlords were actually directors of PAD4U, but rather than respond to my urgent repeated requests for communication, they instead issued a Section 21 repossession order against me. To this day, the landlords refuse to communicate directly. No phone calls, no visits, not even a polite invite to pop in for a chat over a cup of tea. So what about the condition of the rooms? Without any indication of their intentions, PAD4U sent contractors to the property. We were informed that they were to complete the so-called remedial work. Instead, the tenants were incensed that they were expected to leave their homes without notice while they completely covered over all the damp, mould and condensation damage in our flats with paint. Now, PAD4U's insistence that the work be carried out with little regard to tenants' rights led to a number of very unpleasant exchanges with the contractors, and indeed became the last straw for one tenant who gave notice to vacate. It seemed certain when we later examined documentation that these disgraceful disruptive actions without proper notice were not done for the benefit of tenants. PAD4U, who were selling their property, were expecting potential buyers to visit the very next day. Following a number of further complaints, PAD4U carried out what they referred to as a thorough internal investigation. PAD4U continued to insist that a failure under Section 1 constituted a civil matter, despite the police, the local authorities and the Act itself confirming otherwise. It was only after PAD4U were informed that the matter was to be publicised that they changed their stance and admitted that they were wrong. They also decided to accuse me, despite my 100% record, of refusing access to their contractors to carry out their instructions, and that was to be my last straw.